Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk to you about the First World War and its impact on the United States. Specifically, we'll look at how the so-called Great War started in Europe. We will also consider the reaction of the United States and discuss why it was so difficult for the nation to remain neutral. We'll also look at how the United States eventually became involved in the First World War. We will examine the military efforts of the United States, and finally we'll talk about the horrors of trench warfare and how technology changed the face of war. Throughout its history, the United States had reaped the benefits of its distance from overseas unrest and wars. The Atlantic Ocean often provided a welcome buffer from European conflicts. Yet during the early 20th century, this comfortable isolation ended. As America became more involved with world trade, its interests became ever more entwined with the fate of Europe. With a very few exceptions, Europe remained at peace throughout much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, while things appeared peaceful on the surface, other forces were at work beneath the surface that would combine to create a great conflagration by the summer of 1914. Germany, behind the leadership of Wilhelm II, inflicted a humiliating defeat on their neighbor and longtime adversary, France, in the years 1870-1871. In the aftermath of that war, Germany emerged as a unified and powerful nation. Not wishing to lag behind the other nations in the race for empire, German leadership worked toward modernization, expansion, and building of a strong military force. Also coming to play in the lead-up to the war was the weakening of the long-time multinational Ottoman Empire, which was centered in Turkey. As this empire disintegrated, it left newly independent nations such as Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Serbia in particular was very nationalistic. Serbians dreamed of expanding their borders to include other Serbs living in neighboring Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Russians also supported these ambitions. Now, as the Ottoman Empire receded, another multinational empire, Austria-Hungary, saw a chance to gain more territory. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina to the alarm of Russia and Serbia. In this unstable atmosphere, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria paid a state visit to Bosnia in 1914. As Ferdinand and his wife Sophie rode in an open car through Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a young Bosnian Serb gunned them down. This would provide the spark needed to set off a great explosion of war in Europe. By 1914, the major powers of Europe were organized into two great competing alliances. The Triple Entente, or Allied powers, linked Great Britain, France, and Russia. The Triple Alliance, or Central powers, united Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. After the assassination, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which in essence called for them to relinquish their independence. Serbia refused, and Austria declared war July 28th. So what started as a local controversy quickly escalated through the network of alliances. When Austria declared war, Russia, who was allied with Serbia, began mobilization for war along not only the Austria-Hungary border, but also the German borders. When Russia refused to stop mobilization, Germany on August 1, 1914 declared war on Russia, and then on France, Russia's ally, 2 days later. Germany then activated a long-planned invasion of France that went through neutral Belgium, an action that brought Great Britain into the conflict. Italy, although allied with the Central powers, initially stayed out of the war, and then in 1915 joined the Allied powers. Thus began what contemporaries called the Great War, and now known as World War I. So now let's turn our attention to the reaction of the United States to the outbreak of war in Europe. Across the Atlantic Ocean, President Woodrow Wilson called on his fellow American citizens in 1914 to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. Most Americans supported Wilson's position of neutrality. They felt gratitude that 3,000 miles of ocean separated them from war. One of the popular songs of the day kind of summed up the mood. It was called, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." Feminists like Carrie Chapman Catt and Jane Addams formed the Woman's Peace Party. Many Americans took to the streets and marched to protest the war. However, remaining neutral proved to be very difficult for several reasons. In 1914, the United States had a total population of about 92 million people. 1/3 were either foreign-born or one or both parents were immigrants. Many Americans of British ancestry felt a connection with England. About 8 million Americans were of German origin and felt a connection to Germany. Nearly 4 million of Irish Americans hoped a German victory might free Ireland from the British colonial control. Additionally, economic realities made it impossible for the United States to deal with the belligerents on equal terms. Now, technically, as a neutral nation, the United States, in theory, had the right to trade with both Germany and Great Britain. Yet, within days of the war's outbreak, the British had intercepted American ships bound for Germany. Wilson protested strongly. And his protest intensified when in November 1914, Britain declared the North Sea a war zone and began planting mines. So by choking off Germany's maritime imports, Britain hoped to bring Germany to its knees. In March 1915, the British blockaded all German ports. Once more, the U.S. protested, but it was all in vain. Meanwhile, Germany developed its own response to the British blockade. The Germans could not match the British in sea power, so instead they turned to a devastating new weapon, a submarine, called the U-boat. In February 1915, Germany pronounced that the waters around Great Britain was a war zone and warned its U-boats would torpedo ships caught transporting military supplies. Now, procedure had been for U-boats to surface, stop a ship, check its cargo, and unload all passengers before attacking. Now, Germany would engage in what was known as unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning no prior warning would be issued. Wilson responded that Germany would be held accountable for any loss of U.S. ships or lives. On May 1, 1915, the German embassy published announcements in several U.S. newspapers warning Americans about traveling on British or French vessels. 6 days later, just off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat sank a British luxury liner. It was the Lusitania. 1,198 people died as a result of the attack, including 128 American citizens. As newspapers reported the news in bold headlines, U.S. public opinion turned sharply anti-German. The fact that the Lusitania was carrying military contraband came to light only later. Wilson, in 3 stern letters, demanded that Germany cease its unrestricted submarine warfare and to pay reparations to the United States for the deaths that occurred in the Lusitania sinking. Wilson also threatened to break diplomatic relations with Germany, and for a time, Germany agreed not to attack merchant vessels without any warning. Now, despite the president's increasing aggressive language in 1916, he was still very far away from committing the United States to a war. One big obstacle for Wilson was American domestic politics. He was facing a very difficult battle for re-election, and therefore Wilson could not afford to ignore powerful factions that opposed going to war. During the summer of 1916, the keynote speaker at the Democratic Convention, in enumerating Wilson's accomplishments, began shouting, "What did we do? What did we do? We didn't go to war." So the campaign slogan became, "He kept us out of war." Wilson faced a very tough opposition from the Republican candidate Charles Evans Hughes, but eventually was able to eke out a very slim victory. In fact, Wilson won re-election by one of the smallest margins for an incumbent in U.S. history. So now let's talk about how the United States became involved in World War I. By the time of Wilson's re-election, the war in Europe had stalled into a very bloody stalemate. The two sides had dug in, constructing trenches across France from the English Channel to the Swiss border. And after the election, Wilson offered to mediate an end to the war in Europe, but neither side was willing to abandon its major war aims. Speaking before the Senate on January 22, 1917, Wilson asserted the right of the United States to propose a lasting peace settlement, which would have to be a, quote, peace without victory. For in his mind, only a peace among equals could endure. Despite this speech, within a few months, the United States would be at war with Germany. 2 weeks before Wilson's speech, German leaders decided the only way to break the land stalemate was to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They realized the risk they were taking in that the United States would probably enter the war, but they held out the hope that they could possibly deal a knockout blow to the Allies before any U.S. troops could join the fighting. With this announcement of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson went before a joint session of Congress in February 1917, and he broke off all diplomatic relations with Germany. Events took another turn as Wilson learned that the British had intercepted an important message from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government. The note urged the Mexicans to invade the United States. In exchange for making a war on America, Germany promised Mexico the return of its so-called lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When news of the Zimmermann telegram was released to the newspapers, it further inflamed the war spirit in America. Then, in March 1917, German U-boats sank 5 more U.S. merchant vessels in the North Atlantic Sea. Wilson appeared before Congress on April 2, 1917, and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. In his declaration of war, Wilson transformed the war in Europe from one of a conventional struggle to one between democratic ideals and autocratic tyranny. He insisted the world must be safe for democracy. The war resolution passed the Senate by a vote of 82 to 6, and the House agreed by a vote of 373 to 50. So it wasn't a unanimous vote in Congress, but nonetheless the United States voted to go to war. Wilson's argument for a time was bolstered somewhat with the events that occurred in Russia in March 1917. A revolution had occurred that overthrew Russia's Tsarist government and established a provisional government. So for a very brief time, it seemed as if to promise a democratic Russia, and gave Americans the illusion that all the major powers were now fighting for constitutional democracy. This idea was shattered a year later, in November 1917, when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and established a communist dictatorship. Armies on both sides in Europe were decimated and exhausted by the time of Woodrow Wilson's declaration of war. The German offensives of early 1917 had failed to produce an end to the struggle, and French and British counteroffensives had accomplished little beyond adding to the appalling numbers of casualties. The Allies looked desperately to the United States for help. Wilson, who had called on the nation to wage war without stint or limit, was eager to oblige. By the spring of 1917, Great Britain was suffering vast losses due to German submarines. A fleet of American destroyers aided the British Navy in its assault on the U-boats. Many Americans hoped that providing naval assistance alone would be enough to turn the tide of the war. However, it quickly became clear that a major commitment of American ground forces would also be necessary. Britain and France had very few remaining reserves. Also, to compound the problem, early in 1918, Russia had withdrawn from the war altogether. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the new government led by Vladimir Lenin negotiated a separate peace with Germany, and Russia was now out of the war. This action freed additional German troops to go from the east to fight on the Western Front. So now let's discuss the American Expeditionary Force and the impact of the war. In 1917, the United States did not have a large standing army to provide the necessary ground forces. There were only about 120,000 soldiers in the Army and maybe 80,000 in the National Guard. Neither group had any combat experience. And except for the very small number of officers who had participated in the Spanish-American War some 20 years before, and the Mexican intervention of 1916, very few commanders had any battle experience either. Wilson decided that only a national draft could provide the needed men, and despite the protests, the Selective Service Act was passed in May 1917. This brought some 3 million men immediately into the Army, while 2 million more joined various branches of the armed forces voluntarily. Together they were called the American Expeditionary Force. By the summer of 1917, more than 9 1.5 million men under selective service had registered for military duty. 2 million members of the AEF were sent overseas to fight in France. So for the first time in U.S. history, a substantial number of soldiers and sailors fought overseas for an extended period of time. And in some respects, the AEF was the most diverse fighting force the United States had ever assembled. Women, for the first time, were permitted to enlist in non-combative positions, and over 10,000 joined the Navy and a few hundred actually joined the Marines. Nearly 400,000 African American soldiers enlisted in the Army or were drafted into the Army and Navy. More than 50,000 African American soldiers fought in France, although they served in segregated all-black units under white commanders. The engagement of these forces in combat was intense but brief. Not until the spring of 1918 were significant numbers of American ground troops available for battle. They were under the command of General John J. Pershing, and under his command, the AEF joined the fighting in Europe. The experience of American troops during World War I was very different from those of the other nations which had already been fighting for nearly 4 years. British, French, German, and other troops had by this time spent many years living in the vast network of trenches that had been dug into the French countryside. The early trenches dug in 1914 had by this time become elaborate systems of defense. Both lines of trenches were protected by barbed wire entanglements 3 to 5 feet high and 30 yards wide. They were also protected by concrete machine gun nests, mortar batteries, and supported farther back by heavy artillery. These troops lived in holes in the ground separated from each other by a so-called no man's land. European military leaders had been trained to fight wars of movement and maneuver, so the unexpected development of trench warfare left them searching for ways to break through the enemy's lines. They devised plans of breakthrough by throwing masses of men against the enemy's lines that had been battered by artillery barrages. The attacks rarely worked, and machine guns put a multitude of men advancing unprotected across open fields at a severe disadvantage. Millions of men died in this type of warfare. Warfare in the trenches produced unimaginable horror. Battlefields were landscapes of barbed wire, shell holes, mud, and littered with wounded, dying, or dead soldiers. Soldiers living in the trenches dealt with the day-to-day persistent presence of death. Since combat went on for months, soldiers had to carry on in the midst of countless bodies of dead men or remains of men dismembered by artillery barrages. Many soldiers often remembered the stench of decomposing bodies and the swarms of rats that grew bigger each day feeding on the dead bodies in the trenches. The trenches were places of extraordinary physical stress and discomfort, as well as places of intense boredom, laced with the ever-present fear of going over the top. By the time the Americans arrived, morale on both sides was declining, and many soldiers had come to believe that the war would be virtually endless. World War I witnessed a range of new military and other technologies. The trench warfare that characterized the conflict was necessary because of the enormous destructive power of newly improved machine guns and high-powered artillery. It was no longer possible to send troops in a charge over an open field. Trenches served to shelter the troops while allowing limited and usually inconclusive fighting. Technology eventually overtook the trenches too, as tanks and flamethrowers could essentially force the enemy out of their entrenchments. World War I witnessed the use of chemical weapons such as mustard gas and chlorine gas. Soldiers were forced to carry gas masks at all times as a result. The chemical weapons made it possible to launch an attack without direct combat. World War I was also the first conflict in which airplanes played a significant role. While the planes themselves were simple and not very maneuverable, without highly developed anti-aircraft technology, the planes were effective. They were used as bombers, fighters, and for reconnaissance. New battleships were developed which made the use of turbine propulsion, hydraulic gun controls, electric light and power, and wireless telegraphy. Submarines were also used and became significant weapons. All this led to staggering casualty rates. Out of the nearly 65 million men who took up arms during the war, nearly 10 million of them died in battle, while 20 million were permanently wounded in some way. The United States was able to help tip the balance and made it possible for the Allies to finally break through the German lines. In June 1918, American forces at Chateau Thierry assisted the French in repelling the German offensive that had brought them within 50 miles of Paris. Also in September 1918, Americans fought against German forces in the Argonne Forest, in the southern part of a 200-mile attack that lasted nearly 7 weeks. By the end of October, the Germans had been pushed back to their own border. They were faced with an invasion of their own country. Therefore, German military leaders now began to seek an armistice. General Pershing wanted to drive on into Germany, but the Allied leaders refused, and they wanted to accept the German proposal of an armistice. So in 1918, on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the armistice went into effect, and the Great War had finally come to an end. World War I shattered the liberal, rational societies of the 19th and early 20th centuries of Europe. This had been a total war and involved unprecedented mobilization of resources and populations. The incredible destruction and death of nearly 20 million people had undermined the idea that society had progressed to become more rational and more humane, that science and technology could change the world for the better. The turmoil brought on by the war seemed to open the door to even greater insecurities. Revolutions had toppled monarchies, and old empires were now dismembered. As leaders of the Allied nations gathered in Paris, the world waited for a settlement that could establish a lasting peace.